This is my second step in introducing beginning students to conversation skills. In the first step, we did the verb with a positive question. This is going to be a negative question. So I'm going to teach them the negative question, how that's made. Once again, I write down about 5 verbs that I'm going to use, 5 simple verbs. Keep it very, very simple. Once again, the beginning stages of conversation are meant more to introduce them to patterns that will be consistent throughout their speaking career. Vocabulary can be introduced at any time along this way, but patterns are the most important in the beginning. This is not a shotgun approach to learning a language, but a very precise, step-by-step introduction to learning a language. So I have my verbs that I'm going to use. The next thing I do is I review. Anything worth teaching is worth reviewing. And you'll see this through my 40-hour course that you can see after this, that about half of every lesson is taken with reviewing what they learned from lesson 1 to lesson that they're on now. Patterns are used in conjunction with one another to convey feelings quite subconsciously. So review is the key. There's no sense learning something that they're going to forget. It's a wasted effort. So I first begin to review with them. I have them repeat after me in English. Do you go? Did you go? Will you go? Did you eat? Will you eat? Do you study? I want to see them to see if they hear that. They should not have too many difficulties with that. Once again, let them know about this one exception that we introduced them to. It's not that overwhelming. Does. So, does he go? Does he eat? Does he sleep? Does he read? They're mimicking me, just like a mother teaching her child or her infant how to talk. They're basically mimicking each other. And conversation is the same. So, this is what we're going to introduce them today. This is the negative. In the present, the past, and the future. Once again, I don't use these these terms with the students because it's why I have to explain what they are. They're all explained right here. So this is the overview of what we're going to learn today. I begin with the first here, and I have them repeat. Once again, with those simple verbs I just have them repeat. Don't you go? Don't you sleep? Don't you eat? Don't you sleep? Then I give them in their native tongue. For example, I know Korean. I teach Koreans. I would say in Korean, don't you go. They would have to say back to me, don't you go. I would say, don't you sleep. In Korean, they would have to say to me, don't you sleep. Don't you eat? In Korean, they would have to tell me, don't you eat. It's very, very simple. Once again, any language has a marker that's letting them know that, first of all, I'm going to ask you a question, and it's a negative question, and it's in the present tense. So whatever that marker is in Korean or in your language, I basically write it down and I say, whenever you see this in your language, it means don't. Very simple. Don't you go. Then we moved on to didn't. First have them, once again, repeat. Didn't you go? Didn't you eat? Didn't you sleep? I mix it up then. Don't you go? Don't you eat? Don't you sleep? Don't you read? Didn't you read? Then, after I have them repeat it so that they can get their mouth used to saying these things, then I will give them the Korean, and they will have to give me back this in English. So I'll say, didn't you go in Korean? And I'll say, didn't you go? Didn't you study in Korean? They will give me, didn't you study? If I say to them in Korean, didn't you eat? And ask them to translate it, and they go, don't you eat? I want to know why they made that connection. Once again, mistakes are always an avenue to learn. I always look at mistakes as a good thing because I can find out where they may stumble along this process of learning. And that's it's simple to find out just by giving them, didn't you go in Korean? And there's only one translation, didn't you go? If they give me don't you go, I know there's a bit of a difference here. So I will say, no, don't you go in Korean is this, not this. We then move on to the future tense. Once again, they don't need to know present, past, future. You're just giving them an overview here. Have them repeat a couple times. Won't you go? Won't you eat? Won't you sleep? Didn't you go? Didn't you eat? Didn't you sleep? Don't you go? Don't you eat? Don't you sleep? Have them repeat after you. Then I would let them know how this is done in their own language, what this marker is in their language, where they're asking a question in the future, negative. And I will say in Korean to them, won't you go? They'll have to say, won't you go? Won't you study? In Korean, they'll say, won't you study? I'll do that a number of times with those 5 verbs. Then I'll begin to mix it up a little bit. I'll say the Korean, didn't you go? This should come out. Don't you go? This should come out. Won't you go? This should come out. So get them used to don't, didn't, won't. Just use your simple verbs here, and you're basically weaving in and out of these to see if they're making the connection that won't you go in Korean is won't you go in English. Simple. At the end, I'm going to introduce them. After they've gained confidence in this, I'm going to introduce them to the one exception that they find. And that's in the third person singular. Once again, one person, I, you, he. These are only one person, 2 people, we, you, they. As I mentioned yesterday, these categories here of I, you, he, we, you, they is going to be more important in the teaching format of things when we come to the adjectives a little later. But I just want to make sure that they understand that there is one little exception with this, just as they had in their first hour with the positive question, that if the negative question, there is an exception. Instead of don't, where it's used with I, you, we, you, and they, doesn't is used. So once again, I'm not introducing a lot of exceptions to them to confuse things. English makes it very simple because there's only these 2 little exceptions, both in the positive and the negative, when asking a question with a verb very basically. So I will have them repeat after me a number of times just to make sure that their pronunciation is sort of correct. Doesn't he go? Doesn't he sleep? Doesn't he eat? Doesn't he read? Doesn't he ride? Another little trick that I do sometimes in this is I will give them the English and I want them to translate it back to me in Korean. So I will randomly say, for example, back here, don't you go, and I want them to be able to translate that into the Korean. Won't you go? I want them to give me the Korean. Didn't you go? And I want them to translate that back to the Korean for me, just so that I know they're making that connection in their head. Obviously, in their head, they're thinking Korean. They know Korean. They're fluent in Korean. I'm just having them make the connection with this is how it's done. So we go through the exception. Then we also have these 6 categories here, which we're going to be revisiting every lesson: what, where, why, when, who, and how. And just like with the positive question, with the negative question, these all can be combined. What, where, why, when, who, and how. You'll have to translate this for them. It's only 6 things. It's something which they'll always use in their own native tongue. So just remember what, where, why, when, who, how. Sometimes I have the students just repeat after me. What, where, why, when, who, how. What, where, why, when, who, how. And they make some questions for them. What don't you eat? Where didn't you go? Why didn't you study? Who won't you meet? Why didn't you sleep? Then I would, after the repeat it a bit, then I would make some examples in Korean for them. For example, in Korean I would say, what don't you eat? And they would have to translate back to me, what don't you eat? So the overview of what we study with the first 2 lessons, the first step that we take is to introduce them to the positive question-making skill. The second area, the second step that we take is introduce them to the negative question-making skill. If during this process they have a question regarding an adjective, are you good, is she beautiful, these types of things, I just put those to the side, tell them we're not going to address that at this time. We just want to make sure you know the positive and negative questions, how they're made, and we'll deal with that later. I don't want to confuse them. I want to make sure that they're familiar with this. Do you study? Did you study? Will you study? Don't you study? Didn't you study? Won't you study? Does he study? Doesn't he study? Every student obviously is a bit different. Some pick up quickly, some take 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 seconds. In the beginning, it will take them a few seconds to recognize things and say them. But the more you reinforce this with them, the quicker the lag time is, and they will be able to speak quite quickly. So these are the 2 basic steps. The most important thing, review, review, review. Do not introduce a lot of new vocabulary. That's not the focus now. We want to make sure they know how to make a question. Thank you.